Hey, you lovely lot, and welcome back to Crime Analyst and the Intelligence Cell, and part 2 of my analysis of the College of Policing's report into Nicola Bulley's case. Well, the exact title, the Independent External Review of Lancashire Constabulary's Operational Response to Reported Missing Person Nicola Bulley. And yes, that's a real mouthful. And I think it's intentional, actually. So something occurred to me after I finished recording part 1, and I'm going to share that with you just about the title itself. So hopefully you've all watched part 1 of my analysis and assessment of this very weighty report. And yes, it does take time to do. There's more stickies there now. I've been back into the report and analysing a lot more information, which I'm going to share with you. And please do go back and watch my other videos. I've got an extensive catalogue on Nicola's case and the unfolding case as it happened, and talking about things like single points of blame, SPOBs, which I'm going to talk about in the next 2 parts. So a lot has happened since I posted part 1. And one of the things I do want to just mention is the sad news that the Assistant Chief Constable Peter Lawson died at his home on Sunday, the 10th of December. And I did post about that, and also that the case had been referred to the coroner. And I do just want to say my thoughts are with his family and friends and colleagues. He was 50, so still very young. And so that felt very strange to hear that just after this report was published that he died. So I paid attention to that, and I know many of you did too. And just days later, Lancashire Police posted a press release stating that His Majesty's coroner had said that and determined that he had died of natural causes, which I found odd because of his age. But also what stuck out in the press release was that they didn't name the coroner, who, when I checked, turns out to be Dr. James Adley, the same coroner in Nicola's case. So that didn't feel good to me, actually. They should have used an independent coroner to quell any concerns that people might have. And to leave his name out of the press release, well, that seemed very peculiar as well, that omission. And what happened thereafter was that many of you had messaged me to say that Peter Faulding had done a 3-hour Q&A with somebody called Luke from the Break the Ice YouTube channel, and he had done this 3-hour Q&A answering questions that people had, and I was asked had I watched it, and so I had started to watch it, and I got about halfway through, and after Peter Lawson's death that video was removed, as were all the others that Luke had on his channel regarding Peter Faulding, which seemed very strange. And then he put up a post saying it's because the case had become too toxic. So that was quite bizarre. And after finding out that the determination was that he died from natural causes, Luke reposted the original interview with Peter, which I had watched, but not the 3-hour interview. But Peter Faulding also had posted a subsequent statement, and I'll share my thoughts about all of his statements that he's posted, along with my view on his sonar images. Now, some of you will know that Peter Faulding said within the College of Policing review, and I haven't got to that part just yet, that he found the target, that's what a body is called, within the first 6 minutes on February the 7th, and he had handed that information to the police search advisor, and it came back as a negative, that it was nothing, was what Peter was told. And so I wanted to know whether I could see those sonar images. And I have spoken with Peter numerous times. I've interviewed him, and I have now seen those images, and I am going to share with you my thoughts on what I've seen. I do like to see things with my own eyes before I make any before I share an opinion and do my due diligence as is right. So I'm going to come back to that. You'll hear about that in part 2 and part 3. But I do also, just before I get into my analysis, I do just want to mention Gaina Lord's case. And she went missing from Norwich in Norfolk on December the 8th, and I have posted videos about Gaina, 55-year-old mum of 3 who left work early on the 8th of December, and CCTV images were released of her by Norfolk Police, and she's seen walking and running in parts, dashing between cars and traffic, clearly walking and running with purpose and intention, trying to either meet someone or get somewhere within a certain time. And she spends 34 minutes in the cathedral grounds. It's not clear what she was doing, whether she met anybody as yet. And so Norfolk Police are still requesting information from people. If you saw Gaina and if you were in Norwich that afternoon, please do contact them. It's still an ongoing investigation, even though they have now found Gaina's body and she has been formally identified. And what they're saying is that there are early indications consistent with drowning, but they're not saying a formal cause of death because they're still awaiting toxicology. So I'm not going to say anything more about that, but they are still investigating. One of the things that jumped out at me straight away was that Norfolk Police said that they were linking in with Lancashire Police to learn the lessons, and that they had read the College of Policing review. And that's when my heart sank, because lesson 1, which really isn't even in this review, is at the start of a missing person inquiry, you don't release your working hypothesis to the media. Why do you need to release it? Well, you don't. This is a new thing that's happening, and quite a few people have asked me that question. It didn't used to happen. I don't know why it's happening now. My advice would be keep your powder dry. Don't speculate. There's no need to at the start of your inquiries, and speculation only encourages other people to speculate, and that's the problem. So establish the facts first of all. And with Gaina Lord's case, Norfolk Police said right out the gate that Gaina was in the water. And now you can probably see how important it is for a review like this to be crystal clear in the learning. And unfortunately, College of Policing didn't even highlight this or identify why the public began to feel negatively towards Lancashire Police. Although they spotlight, there was a 459% negative switch to viewing Lancashire Police. And I talked about that in part 1 and previous episodes. So the golden lesson is don't speculate from the start. You just encourage other people to do it. And also, please for other forces not to share your working hypothesis right from the start. So that's the golden lesson. And with Gaina's case, sadly, it has ended up with her being found in the water. We don't know how she got there. I'm not going to speculate on that at this stage. I'm not going to say anything, but what's clear to me is that Norfolk Police did do much more in terms of the onset of the investigation, and they put out images of Gaina, for example. So I talk about good practice and learning as the former head of the Homicide Prevention Unit, and it was my vision to always learn from the good and the bad, and a truly intelligent organisation must learn from both. And that's important, no matter how painful it is to hear difficult things. Sometimes you have to pin your ears back and just listen, and as I called it, take the medicine, listen to what's being said, have critical friends. And this was all part of what we were doing in the Racial and Violent Crime Task Force, where we created critical incidents and family liaison officers and the processes in order to investigate, and what the strategic command structure should be. So a lot of that is talked about in this document. So I'm going to jump back in if you're sitting comfortably. And just to say, don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't done so already, and hit the like button. And you can super like as well. That would be fantastic. And make sure you don't miss out on future episodes, and in particular part 3, where I talk more about the sonar images. So I'm going to get onto that. But one of the things I want to just come back to is the title. And after I recorded part 1, it just struck me that the mouthful is sorry, I'll say that again. The title is such a mouthful. And why was it such a mouthful? Normally when you write a report, you want it to be concise and easy. I would have called it something like the review of the Nicola Bulley police investigation. But that word investigation, well, I think it's left out for a reason. I think the clue is in the title. Because from everything now I've read and digested about the case, and everything I saw in terms of the way that it unfolded and the lack of action, the fact that there was no photo of Nicola put out, for a week, and then it was her friend who circulated the photo, and also not just the photo but very helpful information about what was found at the bench and Nicola's baseline behaviour and habits, things that were quite important to understand, particularly when you're appealing for the public's help, really important, and to quell speculation about things as well. But the police didn't do any of that, and in fact it was Paul that released the footage of Nicola at her car, loading the car. And I know that the family were very frustrated with the lack of action by the police. I know that firsthand. And so I do not buy the comment which is written on page 17, and I've underlined it here. You probably can't read it there, so I'm going to read it to you. The on-call press officer that weekend reflected that it was difficult to secure the relevant information and a photograph to circulate. There's no reason for why it was difficult. It's just said, and there's quite a few paragraphs like that within the report. No explanation is given, but that's just fanciful. The family were desperate. Family and friends were desperate. So the police made a public statement. They repeated Nicola had gone in the water. They said that there was no crime. They didn't believe there was a third party involvement or suspicious sightings right at the start of her going missing. And I've talked about that. And that created a lot of their own problems. It was self-generated, actually, where that negative trajectory came from. It was generated by them. And on page 15, and I actually had to number all the pages myself, would you believe, of this report, because they didn't number the pages, which is extremely unhelpful. So I put my own numbers in. But on page 15, it talks about the early investigation, and the POLSAR, so POLSAR stands for the Police Search Advisor, held the view there was no point placing a scene cordon at the scene because he deemed there to be no forensic value. Well, that again tells me that they weren't investigating. Page 16, they say, we're told that there were no suspicious sightings. Well, none except for this man in black, who I've talked about multiple times, where there are 2 witnesses who saw him, as well as there being a number of unsolved sexual assaults on Allotment Road, which I was recently told about. So there's that, which gives cause for concern. Then on page 5, we're told that the current would be sufficient to have carried Nicola to and potentially over the weir a short distance downstream, with a suspected depth of entry being 4.6 metres. Well, for full transparency, I haven't been to the scene, so I haven't stood there myself. I can't talk to that, but I can talk about what others have told me. And they told me that the river was still at that point by the bench. Peter Faulding actually said he threw a stick in and they just stood there and watched it. It didn't move, and that there was a wide rock shelf. And if Nicola had fallen in, she would have been able to stand because of this wide rock shelf. So that's interesting. And I've also seen that on the sonar images too for myself. So although I haven't been there, I have seen corroborating information. Then on page 27, and I'm just going to go there. So if you do want to follow along and if you do want to read the report, then you can do. But on page 27, it's dedicated to the search response. Well, we're told that in 90 minutes, it's determined that 90 minutes, only for 90 minutes a child would survive, and 60 minutes for an adult. And so they conclude that this was, from the outset, more likely a recovery operation. So for me, this right here is the truth and the heart of what was really going on. They believe Nicola went in the water and they were waiting for her body to appear. And when it didn't, and when weeks passed, they started to panic, in my opinion, because they hadn't done the basics. They hadn't done the basics right. And if you do the basics right, the rest will follow. I learned that very early on in my career. And you can never go back and recapture forensic opportunities. Once they're gone, that's it. And that's why I always say you scale up. You scale up, otherwise you've totally kiboshed the investigation, and that is a big problem. And as we know here, there were very unusual circumstances, much like Gaina's case. There are very unusual circumstances in Nicola's case, and that's why. You don't do this in every missing person inquiry, but when there are particularly unusual circumstances, then you have to. Now on page 28, and you might hear my savage wee beastie beast Beatrice in the background there. Page 28, we learn that the Northwest Police Underwater Search and Marine Unit, the NWP-USMU, the police love a good acronym, well, they said that the flow of the river was strong enough to move a body out of the area by the bench and over the weir. Well, that's really interesting and is conflicting. And Peter Faulding disagreed with that, but I'll get to him. The report continues that the Northwest Police Underwater Unit searched on January the 28th and the 29th. There goes Miss B. And there were no dive tasks on January the 29th, and the searches were water-based rather than sonar-based. So that's important. Sonar was used quickly and early on in Gaina's case, Gaina Lord's case, and that's how her body was found. So particularly when there's challenges with visibility, sonar often is what finds people. So the report continues on the 30th of January, the area in front of the bench was dived and searches continued on the 31st of January, the 1st of February and the 2nd of February and the 3rd of February, but with no luck. And then on the 7th of February, Peter Faulding from SGI joined the search using his sonar equipment, which Peter Faulding says is more powerful than the sonar equipment used by the remaining police teams, because a lot of the teams have been decimated and there are very few remaining police teams who have this skill and who have the equipment, the sonar equipment that is at the highest and the most quality pieces of equipment. So he searched the river on the 7th and 8th of February, as we know, and I've talked about that. And you'll recall that Peter Faulding did talk to the media, and he said that after his searches that Nicola was not in the river, and it was a very absolute statement. And he said if she was in the river that he would have found her, i.e. the sonar would have found her. And I know a lot of you are very interested in the Peter Faulding of it all. And as I said, there are 13 pages dedicated to him in the College of Policing review. And I've also analysed his response to the review, as I said, the 3-hour Q&A, well, half of it that he did with Luke. And I've also had conversations with him, and I've looked at the images for myself, and I'm going to tell you what I think about what I've seen. So I know many of you are interested in my opinion, and I really thank you for that. And for me, again, just to reiterate, this is a lot of information to assess and analyse and compare and contrast and form an opinion about, and to do your due diligence and to check and double check, dot the I's and cross the T's before I say anything. And I do all of that, which is why it takes me a lot of time to jump on here and to talk to you, and why I'm surrounded by paper and images and so on. But the College of Police Review and what happened in Lancashire is not all about Peter Faulding. Yes, it's an important part of it, but it's not all about Peter. You see, for me, there are some really interesting areas in the report that I want to talk to you about. And I want to continue just for a moment on with the section about the searches, because the College of Police report stated that the searches continued daily until Nicola was recovered on the 19th of February. Well, I'll also share with you that many local people refute that. They said that there actually wasn't that much police activity on the river across that time. Now, I've heard that from multiple reliable sources, and I believe that's because they were waiting for Nicola's body to appear. As I said at the start, normally a body is found by an unsuspecting dog walker, and I believe that's what they were waiting for. But on page 30, there are 3 pages about searching water and body recovery, 3 pages that talk about how difficult it is to find bodies in water and that it's hazardous. And there's talk about the challenges that are presented due to the visibility or lack thereof with cloudy conditions and weeds and reed beds and the propensity for a body to also move in water. And I've talked about that in previous videos, but there are multiple pages dedicated to it in the report. The report states body recovery is challenging, and even with highly trained personnel, there can be delays in finding a missing person. Okay, so on page 30, and I want to quote directly from what the POLSA said, the lead POLSA. So the POLSA lead, the police search advisor, later described, in inverted commas, the water as having been really dark, and believed that Nicola had already been taken over the weir on arrival by the emergency service first responders on the first day. So that was the belief. really dark waters and that she'd moved that much on the first day, versus what I talked about in some of my videos, that a body drops down. And I talked to other divers and those who recover bodies and so forth, and they all seem to share that the body would drop down. You'd need quite a current to move the body. So that's important about the really dark waters as well, because later on in the report, the diver who said that they undertook the search of the target, so that's what Peter Faulding believed to be Nicola, the target, on February the 7th. Well, I want to quote what the diver said, and it's on page 105 if you want to follow along. He said, "I'm 100% sure that there was no body in that part of the water at that time. It's not very often I dive in such an unobstructed body of water with such a flat bottom and visibility." That really jumped out at me when I read that within the report. So you've got two direct and stark contradictions. You've got all these pages written about poor visibility, really dark waters, and then you've got the diver who went down to search this target that Peter Faulding had found, saying that flat bottom, visibility, unobstructed body of water. And that's very confusing and it's confounding, particularly now I've seen the images for myself. Unfortunately, the report gets murkier, as does this subject of Nicola's case, and particularly relating to the leadership. And I do want to share some things about the leadership with you. You see, I'm interested in leadership. I'm interested in who's at the top. I don't look for who's at the bottom. I look to see who's leading at the top, who's making the critical decisions. And the leaders are ultimately responsible. The buck stops with them. That's what they're paid for, to make difficult and complex and risk-based decisions. What's bizarre here to me is that there were 3 chiefs that were identified as being in charge of the Gold Group. Now, the Gold Group is a strategic group with overall responsibility for the operation, and you have one gold commander in ultimate charge, so that you don't have any blurrings of the line of who's in charge. You've got very clear leadership structure. However, what's bizarre in this report, there are 3, and none of them are actually named, not one, which is extremely unhelpful. There's also on page 51, there's mention of a chief who chose not to cooperate with the review across all these months that it was being written, because they retired, apparently. But, I mean, this review took time. It absolutely took time to carry out and to write. And this particular chief was in charge on the 30th of January to the 5th of February, and that was a significant window of time in this operation. So in that window of time, specifically, the senior investigating officer, who was Detective Superintendent Becky Smith, she did recommend to the chief to declare Nicola's case a critical incident on February the 5th. And that's when the images of Nicola were released by her friend and by Paul, but she was overruled by the Gold Commander. Now that is very important information. Who was that Gold Commander? We don't know. The Gold Commander's not even named. And also, if you're interested in what a critical incident is, it's any incident where the effectiveness of the police response is likely to have a significant impact on the confidence of the victim, their family, and/or the community. So you can understand why it should have been declared a critical incident. And this report, there's a chapter, 18 pages on the leadership, and they didn't declare it a critical incident. And that's deeply concerning. And it's interesting to me that Detective Superintendent Becky Smith is named, and she's front and centre of this, and no other senior officers are. There's no one else to be seen. There's no one else being held to account in this report. And of course, we know now that Peter is sadly dead. But who overruled Becky? So I can start to understand why she had the gritted teeth, because it sounds to me like she wasn't supported, and it should have been declared a critical incident. Then there would have been family liaison officers deployed to the family far earlier. And, well, one of the other things that I found was that the senior officers, whoever they were, and of course we don't know who they were, but the chief officer team failed to take into account the exceptionally high media and public interest in the investigation that should have been evident to them for the first week. So that's on page 46. And that's very interesting to me. And then on page 52, so let me find this specifically because I do want to quote from it. Sorry, page 52 is actually where it talks about the chief officer who didn't cooperate with the review because they retired. That was page 51, sorry. Then on page 52, it talks about media expertise. The review found a sense of disbelief and denial among senior leaders as to how this type of incident could have grown to such an extent. I mean, that tells you everything that you need to know. They're baffled. They still don't know how this grew. But even more so, this is on page 53, this really jumped out at me. While the strategic insight of the media and engagement team had been available to the chief officer team, it was not accepted. So you've got a chief officer or officers not listening to the senior investigating officer, not declaring it a critical incident, not using their in-house experts who advise them around PR and media and engagement, and they decline to listen to them. That is staggering to me, but it really tells you what was going on behind the scenes of how this was so badly mishandled and the lack of the facelessness of it all. There's no one here being named, and that's not okay. There's zero accountability, and it gets worse, unfortunately. Next week, I'm going to get into more of the leadership issues and the knock-on effect of chiefs making decisions that overrule the senior investigating officer, of not declaring a critical incident, of not putting family liaison officers in, of not listening to their in-house expertise. And I'm going to share with you more about that, and also my analysis of Peter Faulding and the assessment of the sonar images where Peter claimed to find Nicola on February the 7th. And I guarantee that you won't want to miss that. So that's a lot to digest, I know, and I just want to end with thinking about Nicola and her family, her children and her friends. Until next time, be curious, ask questions, and always trust your instinct.